Hey guys, one of my favorite personal pastimes related to 40k is going full Redditor mode and pontificating about the inner motivations and behind the scenes events concerning major characters. When massive events occur in the lore, such as the War in Heaven, the birth of Slaanesh, or, say for instance, the Horus Heresy, it's easy to gloss over the event as a whole, only looking at the major plot points and neglecting to delve deeper into the really interesting details that can be found when studying the characters involved. Today, I wanted to take a much closer look at the most influential characters from the Horus Heresy. This is the first video in a 3-part series I'll be releasing on the Traitor Primarchs, the demigods who were responsible for the civil war that tore the galaxy in two. They are now remembered throughout the modern Imperium for their treachery, their horrific war crimes, and perhaps the biggest crime of all, turning away from the beautiful, loving light of the God Emperor. But when we spend some time looking into their backstories, their lives, and their motivations, some different perspectives emerge. If you aren't already at least somewhat sympathetic to some of the traitors, maybe these videos will help you along. On a personal note, I'm pretty excited for this one because on my channel so far, I've mostly leaned into the whole praise the God Emperor, isn't he just the greatest guy ever kind of shtick. And in this series, we get to look at the lives of the Traitor Primarchs, the Great Crusade, and the Horus Heresy from a completely different perspective. So, in this series, I'll be ranking the 9 Traitor Primarchs based on the level of tragedy associated with their falls, and of course, we'll be taking every aspect of their stories into consideration too. Their origins, their upbringings, their parental figures or lack thereof, the tragedies that they were subjected to before they met the Emperor, and then of course their relationships with the Emperor himself. I'm even going to make a graphic that we'll use to rank them. Oh my god, look at that. It's beautiful. This took me 9 whole minutes to make, by the way. Just wanted to say that to let you guys know I spare no expense in making these videos. And with that being said, if you end up enjoying this video, toss it a like, leave a comment to let me know your thoughts, or even subscribe. And let's dive in to our first Primarch. Let's start off by looking at Magnus the Red. I wanted to choose him because he kind of has a bit of everything going on. Was he a good person at his core? I think so. Was he extremely arrogant and self-serving a lot of the time? Yes, he was. Was he a good father to his gene sons? Absolutely. Did he directly betray the Emperor and put those sons in harm's way numerous times? Also, yes, absolutely. Were his reasons for doing that justifiable? They were. See, no matter what angle you look at Magnus from, you'll always see the positives mixed with the negatives. After he was torn away from Terra, Magnus landed on the planet of Prospero, a planet whose population was disproportionately psychically gifted. His firstborn sons, gathered from the lucky citizens of Terra, alongside his second generation of sons, raised from the population of Prospero, were also disproportionately gifted in the ways of channeling the warp. His legion, the Thousand Sons, were known from the get-go for their proficiency in using the warp to further their martial abilities, as opposed to the simple brute force and chaotic berserker tactics of some of their cousins from other legions. However, as with pretty much everything in 40k, there was a catch. Nobody in this universe is allowed to only have or only do cool things without some form of cosmic fuckery coming back to bite them in the end. And with Magnus's sons, that cosmic fuckery came straight from the god of cosmic fuckery himself. You see, the Thousand Sons found themselves constantly at risk of a rather undesirable condition called the flesh change, wherein a sorcerous space marine would find his own body being betrayed by the immaterial power running through it. Sometimes it could be contained or even avoided through sheer power of will. Sometimes it was a slow, debilitating process that would consume the Space Marine over a longer length of time, and sometimes it was a violent, catastrophic, sudden change, and witnesses would see a Thousand Sons warrior mutate before their eyes, his body twisting, bloating, folding into itself, and even in some cases exploding as his soul was corrupted by the power of the warp. And from the moment that Magnus was reunited with his sons, he wanted nothing more than to cure them. He vowed to do anything and everything he could to ensure that his beloved warriors could continue to live and harness their gifts without the horrifying consequences that seemed to come along with them. And so, after a lot of research and looking for answers both in the materium and the immaterium, Magnus eventually found the solution. And he's super smart, and he's dedicated his life to finding and preserving knowledge from around the galaxy. So, you can probably guess the solution that good old Magnus settled on. Oh, yeah, nothing science-related, nothing discovered from a long-lost or newly discovered civilization in the deep reaches of the galaxy. No, he just went ahead and made a deal with the literal god of change and trickery. The god who is known as the Deceiver. But Magnus was so desperate to cure the horrible affliction that was taking the lives of his sons, and so overconfident in his own ability to harness all the power that the warp contained, that he somehow came to the conclusion that the deal he made with the Deceiver wouldn't have any caveats or unforeseen consequences. As part of the deal, he also lost an eye. I guess you could say he lacked foresight. Right? Magnus constantly gets shit on pretty hard by the online 40k community. A lot of people like to jump on how he seemingly squandered near infinite power due to his own arrogance and carelessness. But I think when you delve more deeply into Magnus's character, you come to see Magnus as a character who fits completely perfectly into 40k. To me, he seems to be perfectly balanced. Lorgar, the Primarch of the Wordbearers, who we will discuss at length pretty soon, was well known to resemble the Emperor more closely than any of the other Primarchs. He was also extremely close with Magnus, having met him on his home planet of Colchis alongside the Emperor when the Great Crusade brought the Master of Mankind to his most devoted son's home. And conversations between Lorgar and Magnus are always a lot of fun to read, and due to both of them being psychic, highly philosophical, and more interested in knowledge than brutal conquest, their conversations always seem to be held at a level higher than those between most other Primarchs. This conversation between them is a great example. Lorgar stared openly at the constant metamorphosis of Magnus's visage. A warlord with a missing left eye, the wound sewn closed. A cyclops with one great orb in place of human eyes. A sorcerer with smooth flesh where a right eye had never existed. He spoke. "It has always unnerved me how you look the most like father." Magnus raised a scarred eyebrow. "I? You were made to mirror him, Lorgar, not I. I did not mean physically." Lorgar brushed a scriptured hand across his equally tattooed face. "I'm speaking of your facelessness. You are as powerful as him, and your face dances in the same way." It was Magnus's turn to chuckle. "I am not as strong as our father. Would that I was." Lorgar waved it aside. "Have any of us seen your real face? Did you ever have two eyes?" Magnus tilted his crowned head. "Didn't you hear the story of how I tore the right eye from its socket in sacrifice for knowledge?" Magnus smiled. "I like that one. It might be my favorite." So, in this dialogue, Magnus gives off an impression of pretty supreme self-assurance, but his self-assuredness is immediately justified by the fact that his face is literally not a face. His psychic presence is so immense that even his closest brother, who is also one of the strongest psychers amongst the Primarchs, cannot see his true form. So, of course, Magnus was bound to get a bit cocky. And here's where his lack of foresight really came into play. When Tzeentch made the deal with him to stop the flesh change in his sons, it wasn't a, "Yeah, give me your eye and your sons will be fine forever" type of deal. It was more of a, "Give me your eye, you weird red giant, and I'll stop making your sons explode for a little bit because, surprise, it was me the whole time who was making them do that. Ha 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 ha. And also, I'm definitely going to start doing it to them again next time I need to manipulate you further into joining me." Kind of deal. See, Tzeentch had been playing Magnus since the beginning. And of course Magnus was too arrogant to even consider that he could be outsmarted, but let's be honest, who should hold the most blame for the second most psychic guy in the galaxy not knowing the real truth of the Immaterium? I don't know, maybe the number one most psychic guy in the galaxy who not only knew of the gods of chaos, but had actually spoken with them and was currently involved in fighting a silent war against them for eternity, and who, I don't know, also happened to be the second most psychic guy's dad? The Emperor hiding the truth behind the warp from his sons proved to be the cause of his downfall. Because when Magnus learned of Horus's treachery and tried to warn the Emperor by projecting his soul across the galaxy, he found only one possible path into the Imperial Palace, and that path was offered to him by Tzeentch. But he didn't know what Tzeentch was, and as a result, he allowed Tzeentch and his literal army of infinite demons into the Imperial Palace. This is widely seen now by 40k scholars such as ourselves as a bad move. And by the time Magnus realized his actions had contributed directly to the destruction of the Imperium, he was in a position where he had no choice other than to accept Tzeentch's hand and steal himself and his sons away into the warp. So in conclusion, Magnus did nothing wrong. Just kidding. He did pretty much everything wrong. He was simultaneously the smartest and stupidest Primarch of them all. But remember what I said when I first started talking about him? He is the most perfectly balanced character of all. He is equal parts of everything. Now, personally, I rank Magnus's fall as high as I can get. When I look at what was and what could have been, I cry every time. Now, who else would be better to move on to after discussing Magnus than his best buddy Lorgar? When you look more deeply into the stories of the Primarchs, it becomes just as easy to view them as the tools of a living god as it does to view them as independent, internally motivated beings. For example, Magnus was destined in his creation by the Emperor to use his immense psychic power to harness the power of the Golden Throne once the Great Crusade came to its originally intended conclusion. And Lorgar? Well, he was created by the Emperor to be a living master of propaganda. Conquering the galaxy requires quite a lot of hearts and minds type of work, and Lorgar was the guy who would have excelled at that better than anyone else. In fact, he did. The worlds conquered by the Word-Bearers were the most loyal amongst any in the galaxy. They had far, far lower rates of rebellion than the worlds conquered by Lorgar's brothers. Lorgar was a master at instilling complete and utter loyalty to the Imperium in the worlds he came across. But, this being 40k, of course, there was a catch. Lorgar grew up on Colchis, a world that worshipped an ancient pantheon of gods, through a religion known as the Old Faith, and in this highly religious environment, Lorgar grew an affinity for devotion. He was extremely dedicated to the study of the Old Faith, but Lorgar was also tortured by waking nightmares throughout his youth. He had visions of a being made of pure golden light descending to the surface of his world, accompanied by a one-eyed giant. And from these unceasing visions, Lorgar was granted with a little nugget of truth that would end up being the catalyst to a great many events in the galaxy in the years to come. He knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that that golden being was a god who stood above the four gods of the Old Faith, the one god who was destined to reign supreme over the galaxy. When the Emperor and Magnus the Red landed on Colchis, Lorgar's years and years of torture were finally justified. His vision had come true. God had arrived, and Lorgar was his son. Lorgar trained his warriors in the ways of the devout worship of the Emperor, and the worlds that they left behind during the Great Crusade served to further their beliefs. Not just that the Emperor was the rightful ruler of the great Imperium of man that would conquer the galaxy, but that he was divinity in human form. And the Emperor was not happy about this. While Lorgar had spent his life seeing the Emperor as a god who denied his own divinity, which only further proved his godhood, the Emperor saw Lorgar as a broken tool. He was faulty, in need of repair and realignment, and so the Emperor firebombed Monarchia, a city that stood as the greatest testament in the galaxy to the religious philosophy of the Word-Bearers. He assembled the Word-Bearers there, where he forced them and Lorgar to kneel in shame before him, and he forbade Lorgar from ever espousing his religious views again. If you've read any novels that take place during the Horus Heresy, you're probably familiar with the Iterators. They are highly trained individuals who are dispatched throughout the galaxy to lecture on the beauty and might of the Imperium. They are quite literally the greatest public speakers in the galaxy. They are trained to make you feel greater emotions than you ever have before simply through hearing them tell a simple story. And basically, Lorgar was supposed to be the greatest of them all. Instead, when he found his entire life's purpose shattered in front of his eyes, he eventually came to a resolution. He decided that he would refocus his faith. He would search for the answers he needed in the gods of the Old Faith. For if the god who was meant to rule over them all refused to admit that that was his destiny, why should Lorgar bother with him? As Lorgar's journey towards the truths behind existence advanced, he found himself on the world of Cadia, and it was there that the demon known as Ingethel the Ascended offered to unveil many of the secrets of the four gods of the Old Faith to him. Lorgar readily agreed. In the time that followed, Lorgar's adopted father Corferon and Word-Bearer's first chaplain Erebus would become more heavily involved in the series of events that were suddenly unfolding very quickly throughout the galaxy. Together, they orchestrated the Horus Heresy, allowing the gods who had embraced their undying devotion to spread the corruption of chaos across reality. And Lorgar loved every minute of it. He still remains readily devoted to Chaos Undivided, even receiving the blessing of becoming a demon Primarch, achieving a level of power the likes of which is hardly seen, whether in reality or beyond it. We're going to put Lorgar way down here at the bottom. He is #WarpBlessed. Not only does bro love the Chaos Gods, but he was like their first guy. Lorgar was like a New England Patriots fan in 1990. He wasn't in it for the winning, or the glory, or the trophies, because there were none. He was in it for the love of the game. He was there for the vibes. And then, after some time passed, his passion was rewarded. And this is where the football analogy ends, because Lorgar didn't see his team win 6 Super Bowls. He saw them get ultimately crushed by the Imperium. And the 40k version of Tom Brady in this analogy got totally destroyed by the Emperor and died. But, by all accounts, Lorgar is still having a lovely time even 12,000 years later. You go, Lorgar. You go. Alright, that was actually a kind of happy ending for a character from the Horus Heresy. So let's move on to the saddest character in the history of this entire franchise. What have I called him in the past? The freaky emo of Super Death? You can probably guess who we're moving on to. It's everyone's most forgotten and least cared about traitor Primarch, Conrad Kurze. I'll be honest, I somehow almost feel a little bad saying that. Why, you may ask? Well, because Conrad was ultimately one of the least fortunate Primarchs of all. I mean, we're gonna look at some guys later who were like really unfortunate, but Kurze is pretty high up there too. Conrad's gestation pod crash landed on the grim, dark world of Nostramo. Nostramo was a hive world that orbited a dying star whose light was too weak to penetrate Nostramo's permanently bleak, smog-choked atmosphere. After eventually clawing his way out of his pod and up to the surface of the planet, Conrad's lonely childhood began. Unlike many of his brother Primarchs, Conrad had no family figures to take him in, and instead was forced to raise himself on the filthy streets of Nostramo's largest city, Nostramo Quintus. As a child, he fed himself by hunting the feral animals found in the slums of Nostramo Quintus. Now, that sounds pretty depressing, but don't worry. It gets worse. Conrad was also haunted by horrible visions of the future. These waking nightmares would plague him from his earliest moments and would continue to plague him throughout his life. Additionally, even as a child, Conrad was forced to defend himself from the seemingly endless supply of weird, creepy criminals found throughout Nostramo Quintus, and since he was a Primarch, he killed a lot of people in self-defense at first. You see, Nostramo had a pretty serious planet-wide problem. Pretty much everyone was completely impoverished or overworked, and at least half of them, maybe, were criminals. The out-of-control criminal activity on Nostramo had a profound effect on Conrad, who, it's important to note, could have decided to become a planetary crime lord if he had wanted to. But he was a man of justice. He cared about order. He cared about protecting the innocent, and he cared about the rule of law. And so, he started brutally murdering every single criminal he could find, and hanging their skins in public areas of Nostramo Quintus for everyone to see. He also left behind impaled heads and crucified corpses to warn the worst individuals in Nostraman society what fate awaited them. He was basically Batman, but if Bruce Wayne had been inspired by rabid dogs instead of bats, he was Rabid Dog Man. As Conrad, at this point known as the Night Haunter, butchered his way through Nostramo Quintus, the crime rate eventually began to fall. And before too long, Conrad decided to give the corrupt aristocrats at Nostramo's highest levels of society a simple offer: allow him to essentially become the king of Nostramo or be killed. And when I say killed, I mean, literally torn apart by a psychotic demigod who would then serve your body parts to your family. So, unsurprisingly, they acquiesced, and Conrad became Nostramo's ultimate ruler. But even as the king, his visions of the future never ceased to plague him, and he knew that he would one day be called away from the planet he had fought so hard to pacify to instead wage war on behalf of another being. When the Emperor's delegation arrived at Nostramo, it was the Emperor, Rogal Dorn, Lorgar, Fulgrim, and Ferrus Manus who greeted him on the steps of his palace. As each Primarch stepped forward and turned to introduce himself, Kurze barely reacted, but in his mind's eye, he saw clearly how their fates would play out, either sooner or later. He saw Rogal Dorn being dragged through a dark tunnel by a horde of psychotic killers. He saw the severed head of Ferrus Manus clutched in the grasp of one of his closest allies. He saw Lorgar surrounded by a psychic inferno, looking up at a sky on fire. And he could never quite get a clear view of what the future held for Fulgrim, only able to glimpse him within the briefest mental images, always laughing and slithering away just out of sight. When the Emperor told Kurze that he had come to retrieve him and that he had plans in store for him, Kurze simply relented. He submitted entirely, as if he had already seen this meeting and its outcome, and the outcomes that would follow that outcome in his mind's eye. Because, he had. After having been reunited with his gene sons, Kurze began to teach them to apply the same tactics that had allowed him to conquer Nostramo. The Night Lords would use overwhelming force and utter terror to quickly conquer and pacify worlds. After performing the most disgusting and horrific butchery they possibly could on a world, they would then offer peace and prosperity as a world of the Imperium to those who would cooperate. And just like on Nostramo, this method was pretty effective. But there was an issue. Ultimately, ruling with terror, with the threat of exterminating those who don't follow the rules, only really works when there's someone there to constantly enforce the rules. It didn't take long for the entire planet of Nostramo to fall back into its corrupt criminal ways after Conrad left to join the Emperor. And this trend could be seen across many of the worlds the Night Lords had conquered as well. And as the Great Crusade continued, Conrad's nightmarish visions of the future intensified. The Night Lords had begun to draw deeply from the Nostraman population for new warriors, and it was often only the strongest and most vicious criminals who would survive to become full members of the Legion. As a result, control over the Legion itself became harder for Conrad to maintain, especially as he began to become plagued by visions of his death. His mental state began to deteriorate, and he eventually became unable to control himself, breaking out in violent outbursts. On one such occasion, he was found crouched over the body of Rogel Dorn, weeping. Dorn, who had confronted Conrad in his classic Rogel Dorn, "Hey, I'm a huge humorless douchebag who nobody likes" type of way, had been beaten unconscious by Conrad, who, after being censured and imprisoned, would eventually escape with his legion. So, just put yourself in Conrad's shoes here for a moment. Yes, he's a brutal, horrifying, genocidal maniac, but where in his life was he ever given the choice to be anything else? Even from the moment his gestation pod crash-landed on Nostramo, it was as if the universe wanted him to suffer. He had to literally claw his way out from underground just to reach the surface of the planet, and once he did, he had to immediately fend for himself against the most treacherous scum of Nostraman society. And he was literally a baby. The only thing he was ever rewarded for in his life was his ability to hurt people, and him hurting people was the only thing that he ever saw result in positive change during his life. It was all he knew. It was all he knew how to do. As we talked about with Magnus and Lorgar, each Primarch was destined from birth to fulfill a role of some sort. Magnus was meant to be the guardian/battery of the Golden Throne to open the webway to humanity. Lorgar was meant to be the greatest propagandist who had ever lived. And Conrad? He was meant to be a force for justice, the clearest and most dedicated agent of imperial justice in the galaxy. But we also see that the Primarchs are prone to having their original fates changed due to the Chaos God's interference, and Magnus became the one to destroy the Terran Webway project. Lorgar was, at first, the best propagandist for the Emperor, and then became a way better propagandist for the Emperor and humanity's greatest enemies. And Conrad, through his upbringing, came to believe that justice could only be brought about through out-violencing the most violent people. The Night Lords very willingly joined the Traitors, first linking up with the Iron Warriors and the Wordbearers at Isfahan 5. It was through the events of the Horus Heresy that we saw the Night Lords fall from what they were originally meant to be, to the tragic state that they find themselves in still to this day. Conrad and the Night Lords originally stood against all things criminal. I mean, as much as someone whose job it is to slaughter people and conquer their planets can stand against all things criminal. But Conrad ultimately did every bad thing he had done, and remember, he did a lot, in the missions of securing peace and minimizing future bloodshed. The Night Lords were a legion that prided themselves on the fact that their world had been made peaceful after so many centuries of depraved violence. And during the heresy, Conrad found himself resorting to pure butchery for the sake of butchery, and his legion, now composed significantly of sadistic killers from the streets of Nostramo, slaughtered their way across the galaxy, never once offering peace. Conrad eventually found that no matter what he did, he could not escape the visions of his own death that had plagued him more and more as the years went on. And these visions were the strongest of all. When he foresaw that he would be killed by an imperial assassin, he decided that enough was enough, that he was tired of running and killing, mostly killing. And so, the assassin, Shen, was allowed to infiltrate Kurze's lair on the planet of Sagwalsa and ultimately kill him. Unlike 4 of his brothers, Conrad never pledged himself and his legion to a specific chaos god. And unlike 3 of his brothers, Conrad never pledged himself or his legion to chaos undivided. In fact, he never pledged himself or his legion to any form of chaos at all. He turned against the Imperium simply for the love of the game. Or to put it more accurately, he turned against the Imperium because he was constantly plagued with horrifying visions of the future, and he saw it all happening before it happened, and he realized he was just along for the ride. He knew that fate didn't give a shit about his feelings, and that the galaxy was going to tear itself apart no matter what he did. So for Conrad, we're going to put him here. He could maybe go into the most tragic category, but I'll leave him here simply because when I am in the club and I think of him, I do get sad, but I do not cry every time. But I'll mostly leave him here because he was a psychotic, murderous lunatic from like 3 years old. You don't get unlimited sympathy when you're Conrad Kurze, but his story is still very sad. And do you know who I hope isn't sad that they'll have to wait for the next installment in this series? My legendary channel members. You guys are the flayed human skin-wearing maniacs that patrol the dark, spooky, despair-ridden streets that are most YouTube comment sections. Not mine, though. My comment sections are great, because you're all here. If you'd like to become a member, you can do so through the link in the description. And if you made it all the way to the end, thank you for watching. I won't ask you to like this video, because I want you to see part 2 and 3 first, and then if you like all of them, then maybe you could come back and like this one and also those ones. I don't know. Or not. Anyway, until next time, see ya.